All right. Thank you, everybody, for joining us this morning. We're here for a great hour-long conversation with Dr. Eric Rubenstein. Dr. Rubenstein is no stranger to Pennsylvania, as he was a member of the Penn State 2007 graduating cohort with some of the greatest there ever was, including yours truly. So Dr. Rubenstein and I go way back. He taught in Pennsylvania for a couple years before continuing on to pursue higher education, and is now a teacher education faculty member at the University of Georgia. So Dr. Rubenstein is here this morning to speak with us about the ins and outs of National Proficiency Award applications and share with you some advice and best practices as he's observed in dealing a lot with proficiency awards at the national level. So with that, Dr. Rubenstein, take it away. They're all yours.
Excellent, excellent. Can I ask, can you share permission with me so that I can share my screen?
I'm going to, so actually, Beth, I think you might be the only one that can promote him to, you can make Eric co-host if you can.
Okay, hold on. Yes. Okay, Eric, you should be.
Perfect, perfect. Okay.
And for our attendees, please feel free to ask questions throughout using the Q&A pod as well as the chat box.
Yeah, so I will try and keep this open this way just so that I can continue to see any questions that come up or anything like that, as well as bounce back between some different things. But this morning, what I'd like to talk a little bit about, and John, thank you for the introduction. I've spent a lot of time in my professional career now in higher education working in SAEs and proficiencies and looking at how we can better prepare students to engage in supervised agricultural experience programs, and then looking at how those change based on different demographics. So whether they're in a rural school or they're in an urban school or they're in a more traditional program or a more diverse program that's going to be a little bit more based on ag literacy rather than maybe some ag content skill development, we really can still see that SAE programs continue to actually engage students, and they can actually help students actually build some of those things that we don't necessarily always get the time to teach in our classroom. So this morning, what I'd like to do is to talk a little bit about what SAE is for just a real quick moment to get an idea of where we need to go and how we are going to go about that. And I will say, I'm going to ask for some people to respond to some questions and some things like that so we can kind of build in some discussion here at the beginning. And then thinking about where are some of our questions and where are some of our issues with proficiencies as we kind of move through the application and think about each of those different sections and what can we do to help promote our students as well. So an SAE program, how do we define it? Or what would we call an SAE program? And if not, I will call on people, and I hate to do that, but just so that we can kind of build some discussion and kind of hear what people know.
An SAE is based on student interest.
Absolutely. I think that's a great piece to add, Carol. I think that's very, very important because I think sometimes we build SAE programs on the resources that we have available rather than the student's interest. And we know that if it's not an interest to the students, that they're not going to continue with it.
Dr. Rubenstein, we have Gretchen with her hand raised.
Oh, okay, Gretchen.
Go ahead, Gretchen, I unmuted you.
Yeah, I had to find it real quick. It can be done inside or outside of the classroom, mostly outside of the classroom in order to promote the student learning of what they've learned in the class.
Perfect. I think that's a great point to add with this whole SAE for all and what that looks like and how that actually kind of develops as well. I think that's perfect. Anything else that we know about SAEs?
It can be supervised by the teacher or a mentor.
Absolutely. So someone in the community or a community member that might have some really strong ties into that content area. Perfect.
Kara, I've unmuted you. No, I haven't. You can go, if you can, go ahead and unmute yourself.
Okay. There are different types, like there's the foundational, there could be paid placement, unpaid placement, research, and entrepreneur.
Absolutely. And do you find, does anybody find if they have one that students gravitate more versus the other?
Entrepreneur.
And typically, I think we do see that. We see that whether it's with showing livestock or having some sort of animal-based SAE program, or we see that when it comes to landscaping and landscape businesses, or maybe they're working in an agricultural education SAE program and they're working with students and working with students in the area or with other teachers. I think that they're all great examples of what can be an SAE program, and I agree. I think entrepreneurship typically becomes the one that emerges to the top. So one of the things that I would like to say is, just to kind of give you a real basic idea of what SAE is it's student-led, which I think is really important, whether it's an individual student or it's in a team. It needs to be overseen by the advisor or some sort of community member or someone that can actually provide some guidance to them. And I will say in the definition, I say overseen by the advisor. And that is because I think that regardless of who is the supervisor or who goes out and actually does on-site visits, that the FFA teacher or the ag teacher or the FFA advisor has got to have some sort of overseeing of that as well. So whether that's through some in-class advisement, so we can hear what's going on and maybe giving them some support, or is actually doing some of those on-site visits, I think that that's really, really valuable. The other thing is that it's got to be agriculturally related. And I think that that's one of the things that we sometimes struggle with the most, is actually truly finding the agricultural content piece. There are places around the country and states around the country that they continue to have students that are going to do babysitting as an SAE program. Babysitting isn't necessarily agriculturally related, so we need to think about how that agricultural component really comes into the SAE. I've got some questions up here, but my real question is that, are there good and bad SAE programs? Are there SAE programs that are really strong and are really good, and are there bad SAE programs if they follow that definition? So I guess my question would be is like, if I had, sorry, go ahead.
Well, I think maybe what's going to determine like good versus bad is kind of how the kid executes it, with like maybe doing the research or the follow-up or the record keeping that goes with it. In my experience with capstones, I had kids that started off with really super great ideas, and then they just didn't execute it well because they didn't collect the right data, or they didn't apply the correct math to the data, ran out of time, that kind of thing. So I think the difference between good and bad is really how much the kid polishes it up, and in my mind.
Absolutely. And how do they actually build in scope and sequence? So how do they increase and try to continue to diversify their skills and enhance the skills that they're developing through their SAE program? So how can they describe that, and how can they share that with others? The other thing is that, does every good SAE have to become a proficiency award? Alex, what do you think?
I don't know that it necessarily has to, but I think there's value in setting a student up that what they're choosing could become one if that becomes a goal for them. Like, I'd hate to see us limit a student for something we know isn't going to be applicable.
Excellent. So Alex, I'm going to ask you a follow-up question real quick. So does that mean that every SAE program that our students have need to be a proficiency award area?
I would say perhaps not at an introductory level. I think when you're working with a beginning student, that 9th and 10th grader, trying to get them to see the value, then letting it go a little bit more toward the student idea and whatever it happens to be is fine. as they get toward the end of their high school career, I think we just need to be really honest with them that if it's not in one of the areas, they know that. So it's not a surprise that they want to accomplish something a little bit differently with it, and then it's not an option.
Absolutely. I completely agree. I think that we have to give students the opportunity to find something they're interested in, and it does not have to link directly to a proficiency application. And I think you're exactly right. As they get older, we need to make sure that that's clarified for them so that they're not surprised or they're shocked. But at the same point, it gives them the opportunity to kind of develop their skills and develop their interests as well. So the question that I have then is, or I guess not question, but as we get into this, one of the things that I want to make sure that you're aware of is the fact that there are proficiency applications and sample proficiency applications for each of the different areas. If you go to the link that is here on the screen, so and I'll let this sit up here for a second. You can also go onto the National FFA website and you can just search Agricultural Proficiency Awards. And then as you scroll down, you're going to see this proficiency resources piece down here at the bottom of the page. And then you're going to click on that proficiency resources tab. When you click on there, it's going to take it to their box account. And then you're just going to click on that application samples. And then through there, you're going to be able to pick a variety of different samples of what they look like. So you can get some ideas of how some of these different applications are put together. Now, the big thing that I will tell you is that each of these applications were one of the national finalists. And so they are ones that would be very, very equitable to what would get into a national finalist category on that given year. Now, remember that every year is a little bit different. And so in the 6 years that I worked with the proficiency application process and actually on the national committee, these change. And so there's going to be some differences based on what types of things come in and what types of applications are submitted. They give you a really good idea of what you can and what you need to do in those applications. So as we look at them and we look at some do's and don'ts, I think that there are some things that we really need to keep in mind. The first one that we absolutely cannot do, and I think that we get ourselves caught sometimes because a student may submit an application to multiple different areas or multiple different proficiency award areas. And sometimes what we'll do is we'll copy and paste and pull things from one application and put it into another. That is considered plagiarism, and that is considered self-plagiarism. It will get caught at the national level and it will get pulled, and that student will be disqualified. So definitely make sure that we're careful that everything is original work that year. The application needs to be written by the student. You should not write it as the teacher. It should be coming from the student's words, because what's going to happen is that student's application, if they make it into the Final Four, they're then going to have to go and be interviewed. And honestly, there's very little you're going to do to help prepare that student if they didn't actually do the work that was actually done and said that they did in that application. And the last one then, the don'ts, is just not wait until the last minute. I think I see a lot of teachers that wait until the very last moment to actually begin that proficiency application. And that is where, honestly, I think most of the problems come from. We're rushing to get them done. I know that there's lots of things on our plate, and I know we struggle with that. But sometimes that just is going to be a big deterrent, because as you read them, you can really find and see that those applications were done just quickly to get them done in time.
Dr. Rubenstein, I have a question, if I could interject here. So,
Yeah.
And I apologize if you plan to get to this in a bit, but when do you suggest, what time of year do you suggest teachers get their students started on the application?
Absolutely. So I think that if I'm not mistaken, at least here in the state of Georgia, our applications are due on February 15th to start that process here in the state. And so what I always recommend is that should start by December 1st. And yes, there are going to be some things that are going to be completing, so that income and expense statement is going to probably be something that we're going to have to continue to work on and to continue to enhance until the end of that year. But we're really getting started on writing up some of those different portions, as well as the skills, competency, and knowledges, the efficiency factors. All of those things can begin to be done prior to the end of that calendar year. So I try to tell teachers December 1st should be kind of like a really good start date, or even sometimes a little before. And what I always like about that is that over that winter break time, the students really going in and they're kind of wrapping up and pulling together their record books so that when they come back in January, now what you're working on is you're really looking at fine-tuning the actual written portions, and now you're working on the financial portions of the application. And the financial portions of the application are probably some of the trickiest components, because that's one of the things that it doesn't matter how well the application's written. If there are financial errors, and I know that Carol can attest to this as well, that if there's a financial error on that page, it will not become a national finalist, or it's going to be very, very hard for that application to become a national finalist. And so if the point of this is, and remember that the point of a proficiency application is not always about the classroom instruction or the classroom learning component. This is now the competitive event and the competitive component. So there is a win and a lose to some of this. And so as we look at that, we've really got to make sure that we kind of fine tune that so that we know that that student is set up for the best success as possible to hopefully become one of the final four that then will be recognized on stage at National FFA Convention. Did that answer your question, John?
Yes, thank you.
Absolutely. So I think that there are the dues follow the rubric. I think that that's pretty self-explanatory, and we're going to walk through and look at some of those components of the rubric here this morning. Do your part in supervising the SAE. Do your part by doing it either in the classroom or on site. Whatever that looks like, make sure that you're actively engaged in that. The other piece to that is that every time you see that student, or every time one of those community members goes out and supervises those students, make sure they're taking pictures. The worst thing is that at the end of this entire time, you have very few pictures that you're going to be able to use in the application. And now all of a sudden you're going to have to do a photo shoot day where you go out and you take 6 photos or 7 photos just so you have some extras. And you're going to then take those photos and the child is dressed the exact same way in every single picture. Or it's the exact same time of year in every single picture. One of the things that's noted is there are judges that will sit there and they will look at them and say, well, I mean, they really didn't take pictures throughout the entire process. They just kind of staged them so they can write about them. They may lose some points. In some cases, that 1 or 2 point difference in that photo section could make or break your student's chance of being a national finalist. So it's something really simple that we can do instead of kind of getting into that idea where we just go out and do one photo shoot at the end. Use numbers. Throughout the application on the skills, competency, and knowledge areas, on the efficiency factors, we need to use numerical values. Everything has to be measurable. The people that are looking at this and judging this, they have to be able to, in their mind, figure out exactly what is happening and exactly what those values mean. If we wait until the end and we don't actually let those, and we use more of a qualitative component rather than a quantitative component because we've not necessarily pulled some of that data together, we're really going to struggle to see those students kind of make that step into the next stage. All of those qualitative ones, they're hard to measure. If it's like a novice to a certified, or it's a novice to advanced, we don't know what that means. Every person interprets that a little bit differently. And so even if we use the word certified, we'd have to very clearly define what does certification mean for whatever that skill level is or whatever that efficiency factor is. So if we can use a numerical value, it's really going to help us strengthen our ability to explain what it is that we learn throughout the process. Be specific and get to the point. We don't need a lot of fluff. You only have so much space to write a lot of these different sections. And so you need to make sure that it's very, very poignant and very to the point, very succinct, because you're trying to get a lot of information in this application in a very short or a very small amount of space. So just be very, very specific. Write in first person. It's not in third person. It should be written as though it is the student that is actually saying that. And then make sure that we use SMART goals throughout the application and as we write about those goals for the project that we, or the program, that we actually then use those SMART goals as we learn about them. So as we look at the application, I'm going to go through these, and please stop me and ask any questions as we go through them, just to make sure that I can explain each piece in each section. John?
Eric, before we jump ahead, we've got 2 items here. Carol has asked questions in the chat box. I'm not sure if you see it or not there, but can you copy info from one year to the next if they apply in the same area the second year?
Say that again. I'm sorry, I missed that.
Can you copy information from one year to the next if they apply in the same area the second year?
You should be able to use that information again, but if they win the state award, they can't go back to the national level. So if you think about that, if they are applying in, if they're applying in that same area and it's the same student, and if they've not won the state level, they're never going to be checked at the national level for plagiarism. If it's the student's application and it's their work and you're working to enhance that and add to it, I don't see a problem with that at all, because it's still that same area and that application never won in the program.
That answer your question, Carol?
Yes, thank you.
Absolutely, absolutely. So if you look at the first page of the application, there are 3 boxes that you can actually answer questions, and you need to answer those questions as succinctly as possible. If you remember from the older applications, for those of you that have done this for a while, it was to tell a little bit about how your SAE related to the award area, but the wording was changed a little bit. So it was all about kind of like, they wanted you to tell the story of how you got to that point. That's not necessarily the case as well. And so when you see that and you kind of think about this first question, it should be very much about is getting to the point of explaining what your SAE is, how it relates to the award area, and telling us any pertinent information that there is about what you did in your SAE, or what that student did in their SAE. So if they sold an animal and they sold that animal, I mean, for a lot more money than they normally would have, that probably needs to be documented there, or needs to be documented somewhere in the application. If they bought something that was really a large expense, but it doesn't necessarily show somewhere, that's going to need to be explained in that part. So definitely think about how you're explaining that and using that succinctly, but use that to then justify some of those different pieces of the application, especially some of the financial components as well. Diane, I know you have your hand raised.
Yeah, I was just going back to when you talk about writing in first person, it's a little confusing, because I know, like, when we have kids writing, for a science or like a lab report and things like that, they are like, it's drilled to not like I this. So is there, I don't know, I guess, how do we distinguish that for the kids, or is it just because they want to know that the kid's telling the story? Or
I think that's a great point. So the way that I would explain it to students, and my students, as I do that now with my pre-service teachers, is getting them to understand that this is no longer about the science behind it, or it's not about explaining the justification. It's telling,
okay.
It's the explanation of what you did as a person. So
Okay.
tell them your story. Instead of it being kind of like it be very scientific, and the fact that we need to justify each thing, it's now about them telling their own personal story about what they did in their program.
Okay.
And so I think, and I've seen, if we can get the students to think about it in that way, they sometimes it's a little easier for them to write in that first person tense. Now, I will say, you don't necessarily it doesn't need to be like I throughout every sentence needs to start with I did this. It can be, but we do want to say, like, my family has been involved in this industry for 35 years. My SAE program relates to this because I took this component of the family business or whatever. So it's a way for them to kind of explain their story, but I don't know that I would use the word I all the way through. Try and differentiate that a little bit, but it should be very much in first person about their story, them telling the reader exactly what they did and exactly what their SAE program was about.
Perfect. Okay. Thank you.
Yes, absolutely. On that explanation, the other thing is that we need to make sure, and it's underlined there, is a clear understanding. We need to clearly be able to articulate exactly what has happened in that program as we work through it. The second piece is then your responsibilities section. In the responsibilities section, it gets a little bit more difficult for students that don't have more than 2 years of experience. So I find that with students that only have 2 years of experience, that it's a little harder for them to be able to show as much growth sometimes in this description of where their roles and responsibilities changed and those management decisions changed. Whereas if they have multiple years, it's really easy for them to say, okay, in year 1, I did this. In year 2, I did this. In year 3, I became this, or I did this. And I think that that really kind of articulates a little easier. And it's easier for the reviewer to see that as well. So as you're writing that, break it into sections. So each of these different pieces, if you're looking at roles and responsibilities or management, make sure that you use those words in the write-up. My roles and responsibilities changed from year 1 to year 2 by adding this. The management decisions that I made in year 2 affected this in year 3. So make sure that that's articulated really, really well there. The other thing is to break it down into years really helps the reader be able to say, okay, I can see where the growth was made each year through the project or through the program. And it makes it very clear for them to be able to try to articulate that and visualize it. Because remember, the entire time they're looking at this proficiency application, there is no one there that can answer questions. And there's no record book that they can go to look at. It's all based on what is written in that application. So we've got to be very, very articulate in the way that we describe that. Questions on the responsibility section? Excellent. So on the challenge section, this is one where I think we can kind of get caught in some traps. For a student that's going to have, and for all students, I think one of the things that they struggle with is time management and being able to figure out how to balance everything that they need to do in their daily lives, whether it's from sports to schoolwork to whatever. They sometimes struggle with that component. So one of the things that I always want to tell students, and I tell all of my pre-service teachers, is never let them write that time management or time was their biggest challenge or the greatest challenge that they had in their SAE program. It should derive directly from something that they had to do in their SAE. It may have been a decision that they had to make. It may have been the fact that they were working with family and engaging with family between a personal relationship of what that family meant and the business relationship and how those were different and how they had to balance that and how they had to kind of work, kind of articulately between those two realms really is something that sometimes students will struggle with. That's a challenge. A really rainy year, that's a challenge sometimes if we're doing row crops. So make sure that it derives directly from the project, not that it's something a little bit more global that, yeah, every student is going to struggle with, because I think what we see is that there's so many judges that will see that idea over and over and over again that they don't necessarily pick up as that's really a greatest challenge for the student. They believe that there's probably an even bigger challenge, but the student didn't necessarily take the time and think through it. This is one of those sections where if it makes it feel like the application was rushed through and gotten done quickly just to meet a deadline. And so if you can spend some time really thinking about a true challenge, that's where this question can help alleviate some of those concerns for the reviewer as they work through that process. As we look at the accomplishment section, this is where they are going to have this is where it's continually based on the SAE program and how decisions that they made and the accomplishments they made impacted the growth or the development or the enhancement of the SAE. So if the student decided to change a feed ration or the feeding program for their animals, that may have led to a higher percentage of growth and a higher growth rate, and that's going to then lead to some better outcomes for them. So what were some of those decisions and what were some of those accomplishments that they made? Or they had. Maybe it was that they increased their clientele if they're working in a landscape business and they're increasing it from 3 to 17 people in 4 years. That's a pretty big accomplishment. That's a great thing for that student to be able to do. Then in that explanation component, they can explain how they went about doing that. And so those are really, really key pieces. But remember, your accomplishments are directly and only to be related to how you enhance the SAE program. The impacts area is how the decisions and how things from your SAE program are impacting your future careers and your future decisions and where you plan to go or where that student plans to go in the future. I think a lot of times I see that teachers and students struggle with balancing between the two. So we sometimes have what really are impacts in the accomplishments and sometimes what some of those accomplishments are in the impacts. And so make sure that we very closely look at the rubric to see how they vary or how they change. And that's going to be really important for the student. The one thing is that make sure you can articulate in each of the descriptions exactly how that's impacted either the program or the future of the student. If it's not clearly illustrated, that's where you start to lose some points. Again, these are not huge point sections, but if there's little issues in each of them, those points add up, and then that becomes a larger issue for you as you move through the application, you move through each of the different sections. When you look at the scope and responsibility, this is one that I think we see a lot of points and a lot of point variance. This and the next 3 sections that we're going to talk about as well. So in here, the biggest thing is we need to provide a description. And a lot of times if we use the AET system, it will pull in a very short description. You need to go in and add more. You need to write up exactly what happened in that SAE program. If there are animals involved, there should be names of animals or how many animals they had. And so that we can follow those animals from the beginning of the program to the end of the program. If you sold certain animals in a year, that's a great opportunity for you to be able to explain that you sold that animal and you sold that piece of livestock, or you sold this piece of equipment. That can be done in this component. What we also want to see is how did some of those responsibilities and growth occur? So we need to see growth each year, not just in the amount of hours, not just in the amount of money that they made, but truly in the skills and the learning that they did. And that comes from that description that you're going to write. While AET is an amazing program and it does do some amazing things, this is the one section that if you don't take some time and really write that out and articulate that and go back and re-illustrate it, it does become a little bit of an issue for some people when they're reviewing them because they're just limited in what they know. The more information you can provide here, the easier it is for the reviewers to be able to sit down and to find answers to questions as they're moving through the application. So I will tell you, this is one of the first sections that I come to. The second section that I go to is then those questions at the beginning, in particular question number 1 and question number 2. And then if I can't find it there, then I go to the personal page and the pictures at the end of the application. If we can work to really make sure that that's illustrated here and explained, that's going to be really important. Also, there are times in an SAE program where something happened to the student. Maybe they got ill, whatever occurred, that they then had a decrease in the number of hours or a decrease in the amount of money that they were making in that program. That should be explained here. What happened that we didn't see that growth? What was something that that student had to overcome? That's a great thing that then can be used in that challenge question or question number 3 at the beginning of the application. But make sure that we can articulate that, especially if we see something that just doesn't look like it should be. We need to make sure that there's some explanation here as well as we look at that. The last piece that I would say with this is if you have multiple different programs and multiple different sections to that programs, break them out and break them into different components on this piece. So for example, if there are certain things that you did that were dealing with hay production, great. And then there were things with grain production, perfect. And then there were things with taking care of the equipment and maintenance on the equipment, perfect. All of those things break down and we can see each of those components and they list out, and we can then see a description of exactly what you did in that section. It makes it, again, a lot easier for us to really articulate and for us to be able to really understand what all happened in that SAE program. Okay, so the more detail here and the more a breakout we can make or we can have, that's going to then impact the overall score that you're going to get, because we can then articulate and see exactly what you're trying to say in that process. So for example, if we look here, this is an example of one in a research program that if we see just a brief explanation, we get an idea of that experimental and testing component in year number 2. Then in year number 2, we get to the point. So this is the data collection. Here's the presentation preparation portion, and then here's the actual project presentation. So we split each of those different pieces out, and we can then articulate or explain exactly what happened in that section. This provides a lot more detail than simply saying we had an environmental systems project here that was based on water quality. It tells us a lot more about what that student did, and we can begin to see what that student was actually doing in their program. Questions so far?
Dr. Rubenstein, you talking about, like multiple years, I'm not like seeing kids for multiple years in a row. I see a kid, and a lot of my kids are one and done. And, you know, so I mean, looking at something like this, I'm like, I'm like, I don't even know where to start to hold on to a kid for that long.
Yeah, I don't get me wrong. I think that's an issue for a lot of teachers right now because there's so many different options for students throughout the school. And so one of the things that I can try and tell you is, as you're looking at then developing that proficiency application, what I would tell you is to try to give that student as many experiences as possible. Hopefully find something that they've done in the past as well, so that there's some higher level skills that are being developed and you can articulate those about how they were enhanced throughout the year. And then I think breaking that down to try to articulate exactly what they were doing, I think that will try to give you the absolute best chance as you're working through this application.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Diane, if I could just interject too, if offering SAE as a standalone credit course in your program, obviously that's something you'd have to navigate with your school and your district, but if offering SAE as a standalone, perhaps independent study course as an option, that's a way for you to remain engaged with students, even if they're not in one of your other classes year to year.
Okay.
Very good point as well.
Right. Thank you.
Other questions on this portion of the application so far? The next one's income and expenses. And I'll be honest, I think this is probably the one where we have the most issue. And this is the one that will carry some of the biggest weight when it comes to the national level and coming to the review of the applications. So as you look at income and expenses, we have to understand that there cannot be errors. We have got to find a way to go through, and you've got to spend some time looking at each of them and calculating them to make sure that there aren't errors in the process. If you're bringing it in from AET, I know that we've seen a lot less errors, and the ones that I've looked at and worked with, there's a lot less errors in the process when that happens. When you're not using AET in your classroom and then you actually go through and you have to hand enter a lot of that data, we do notice that there are quite a few more errors that we see in that process, just because sometimes some of the calculations will get a little wonky on you, or there's information that you inputted in a section that you thought was correct, but maybe it should have been in another section, and so it throws off those numbers and throws off what it should look like. Just make sure that you go through and you spend some time looking at this section. Now, as you look at this component, one of the things that I'll tell you is, if you look here on the screen where you're going from a gross revenue of $3,500, but then you're going to a gross revenue of $28,000, we need to be able to see where that change occurred. And so if you can see, here we've got some ideas of where this was at. We see what this inventory purchase for resale is. We've seen what our expenses are as well. I can then say, okay, so if things are increasing in value and they're doing something to enhance whatever that product is, then there is going to be an increase in revenue. So I can justify what this looks like. There are times, don't get me wrong, that there is no significant expense and no inventory that's purchased for resale. There is nothing that's added to the project or to the program, but yet we have a $45,000 sale and revenue. Something doesn't add up. And so we've got to make sure that everything is articulated in the process. Now, the other thing that becomes really tricky is this idea of things that are transferred, that are from non-current, bartered, or labor exchanged. This section becomes really difficult because a lot of times we are seeing students that are going to work on their family farm, or they're going to work with a family business or enterprise. And in return for working for them for little or no pay, they're going to get something that goes along to their SAE program. So that's going to be maybe that they're not going to have to pay for feed, or they're not going to have to pay for transportation for their livestock if they're going somewhere. It may mean that they're going to have they're not going to have to pay for gas to move their lawn equipment around from job to job because mom and dad are going to pay for that, and they're going to let them use their trailer or whatever. That is going to be really important that we understand that that's there. So there is a calculation that you can use to calculate this to make sure that it adds up in the application. It is that 1F, so this line here, must equal 2D, so this non-cash expenses that are transferred, bartered, or labor exchanged, plus 2E, the contributed non-cash expenses from gift or non-labor exchanged. And then in 4, so the non-current inventory, it's going to be 4B, so transfer in from operations, or 4C, the contributed, plus 4C, contributed inventory. So 1F equals, let me make sure that I'm in the right thing here. 1F equals 2D plus 2E plus 4B plus 4C. If any of that does not calculate, that is a major financial issue when it comes to the inventory or the income and expense statement. The other thing is that sometimes we're going to see that there is a large purchase or there is a large sale. If there isn't a way to justify that, or it doesn't make sense when you look at the numbers, you just notice that there's a large change in that income statement or in that expense statement, you need to make sure that that's explained somewhere in the application. So whether that's in the beginning questions, it's in the scope and sequence pages, or it's at the end on your personal pages, or the personal page, that has to be explained. We have got to find where that is in the process or in the program. Remember, we don't have an application, or we don't have an actual record book to look at while we're reading the applications. So you want to make sure that it's very well articulated in the project or in the write-up. The other component of that is that if we can't find it, then we have to say to someone, okay, well, score it as you see it. And I can promise you, sadly, that doesn't go in the student's favor. If it's not explained and we know that that number is there, but we can't explain what it is, we end up then having to take points off because we can't justify what that looks like or why that's there. And so that becomes a really big piece for a lot of students, that it may be very, very truthful, but we can't justify it in the application, and so it looks like an error. So one of the things that I will tell you is use different people in your state. I know that Mrs. Fay and Carol has had a lot of experience with this and has worked at the national level and judge. Send them to her and have her look at them and make sure that she doesn't see where some of those errors or some of those questions might arise from. Because if there's a question or anybody has a question, you just want to find a way to actually then explain what that question or how we can answer that question rather than leaving it there and leaving it open for interpretation. That becomes really, really difficult. I agree, Carol, exactly. If they have a large purchase, have them explain it, where the money came from. So yeah, so that's the other question. I think that's perfect, Carol, is that if they buy something, where did they get the money? If they didn't have money based on their actual application, where did they get the $12,000 to go and purchase a brand new trailer? Where did they get all of that to come to actually be able to make these changes or to purchase the inventory that they need? That's really important for students because a lot of times mom and dad are going to give them that money and they're going to let them, and then they're going to pay them back or they're going to give them money back in return. That's got to be explained in this application somewhere so that we can see what that looks like and why it's working the way that it is. This then is going to link to the next pages, which are your current and non-current inventory. The current inventory is anything that is going to be used within that year. So if you breed an animal, the animal is alive, it's on your farm, but it's not actually at breeding age yet. It goes on the current inventory side. When it becomes a breeding age and it's able to go into production, then it moves to the non-current side, and non-current is going to be things that are going to last over time. They're probably going to have some depreciation to them, and we'll talk about that in just a moment. The other thing that catches a lot of people is if you're running a program and you're running an SAE, if you have animals or you've got a landscape business or you've got a snow removal business or you've got whatever, there is probably something that you have in your possession that is a current inventory. If you have animals, I can promise you've got to have something because the animal is going to be alive on December 31st. The animal is then going to still be alive on January 1st. I don't know anywhere or any feed store that's going to be coming and delivering you feed on January 1st so that you have food just for the beginning of the new year. If that's not there, again, it opens the room for questions from the people that are judging it and evaluating it, the applications. So you want to make sure that you try and provide as much information there as possible. This is great that especially if you have animals in here, this is a great way for you to go in and actually explain, this is this animal, this is when their birth date was, whatever. So again, the individual and the actual reviewer can process or follow that animal throughout the project. And that becomes really, really helpful. On the next page, so when you get to, here it is, sorry. When you get to the, no, I'm sorry. What happened to that page? I am not, it's missing. So let me, I don't know what happened. So let me open up an application here real quick, just so that we can see the second piece to that. Oops, went too far. So on the second side of this, in this one, this is then going to be your non-current inventory side. On the non-current side, there has to be depreciation. There are some that are going to be non-depreciable draft, pleasure, and breeding animals. We can talk about some examples of those if we have questions on that. But a majority of the animals that you're going to have are going to depreciate over time. They're not going to be the top of their class. They're not going to have won the Kentucky Derby. They're not going to have won the Houston Livestock Show. They're going to decrease in value once they get to a production standpoint. And so we need to be able to see what that depreciation is. If there is not depreciation claimed on something, then they're going to see, and you're going to see some points deducted from that as well. It needs to be, you need to be able to really to see exactly what that looks like. Now, what I would tell you is based on some of these, what you can tell from some of these beginning ones here, that these animals did not really kind of come out the way that they thought they were going to. If I'm not mistaken, I believe this is a rabbit book as well. And so then you can see that there are some that obviously must have done a little better when they were showing them. And so you can see that those values change as well. Maybe they have some genetic offspring that are going to be really helpful or really powerful. Maybe they were bred from an animal that has a really great lineage. That's going to help the value of that. So you've got to be able to justify some of that as well so we can explain and see what that looks like. The one thing I would say is if you have something that does not look like it makes sense, provide some justification about that genetic makeup so that you can see what that looks like and see where that comes from for those animals as well. Absolutely. Thank you, Carol. I think that's perfect. The name, the breed, the gender, all in there so that we can see exactly where they are, especially if there's multiple animals in that project. Absolutely. The other piece to this is that we also are going to have machinery and equipment. And sometimes we get into some questions about what should be included here, especially if the student doesn't own it. If the student does not own the equipment, it doesn't belong on this page. So if it's a bartered item that is going to be there, or it's transferred, or it's from labor, that is going to be something that we don't necessarily include. If it's a gift, so someone gives them a gift that then goes into the project or goes into the program, it should be included on these pages. And so it does then include depreciation. Yes, they didn't pay for it, but someone gave them a gift as a present that goes into their program. That does need to then have that depreciation, and that does need to be claimed here, again, if it is a gift. Okay, Diane, you have your hand raised again. Oh, Diane?
Did we answer your question, Diane?
Yeah, am I on?
Yeah.
Okay, all right. No, I was just like, I was a little confused, I guess, about having like animals that are like in-house on your property as not being considered current inventory. I guess I'm looking at it from like a bank standpoint. I've got 200 head of dairy here, and on a bank statement, they're current inventory, and they're given kind of this average, understandably, some of them might be worth $1,000 and some of them might be worth $1,800. Some of them might be worth $2,500, but for the most part, you have this industry standard with livestock in particular that, okay, the average is, we're going to say 200 head at, $1,800, with the understanding that somebody might break a leg today, or the next cow next to her might make 150 pounds today. So I guess I'm just a little confused how something that you have in your possession wouldn't be considered current inventory I don't know, I guess like if we depreciated our livestock, I'm not sure if I'm asking the question. I'm just confused why like a current flock or herd would not be in the current inventory section.
It's all based, so the way that it's worded and the way that it's calculated for this application and based on the creators of kind of how this came together,
Okay.
based on this definition that if it's in your possession for more than a year, then it should be claimed under non-current. Current is something, and current is fluid.
Okay.
It's going to be something that comes and goes. So, if
Okay.
so for example, your dairy bulls that you're going to have, you're going to
Right.
sell. They would always be on a current inventory. Your heifers, until they're actually bred and they calve the first time, they're going to be on that current inventory side. Once they've bred and they become a breeding animal and they become a production animal, then
Okay.
they're on the non-current side. So that way, they're in production. Unless something adversely happens, they are not going to really see. They're not going to actually have a change in their value. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it can make sense for now.
I mean, I understand. So the one thing I will tell you, and this is my own caveat, and Carol, pretend like I didn't say this because I know you've heard this from the other side and at the national level as well. I think that there are some things that go along with the application that are particular to this application and sometimes do not necessarily always apply to some of the business aspects that we teach or that we should be teaching. I mean, I'm not saying that's right, wrong, or indifferent. It is just, I mean, what I'm trying to tell you is this is how the application works.
Okay, that's fine.
I don't mean that in a bad way. I just mean it is in like, if that's how they're going to look at this. So if
Sure.
you can do it that way, that's how you're going to get the points that you need to be able to have that student move through.
Okay. Yeah.
Again, right, wrong, or indifferent, it just kind of is the situation.
That makes perfect sense. It's kind of like, this is how we want it done, so this is how we're going to do it, and that makes sense.
Yep. Yeah. And I mean, I know Carol was there one year when I kind of asked quite a few questions and had some explanation. I wanted some explanation on some different things that basically I got told, well, this is just the way that we do it. So this is what okay. I am a nobody in this process. I am here just to help you. But that is the way that is looked to be done. So we just want to make sure that as you're working with students that you just do it the way that they're looking for so you can get that point value.
Okay.
I agree. I think dairy is one of the ones that kind of gets a little bit tricky on that. When you look at some of the other livestock areas, you don't see that problem quite as much, but I do know in dairy that is just has a different spin to it.
Okay.
Okay. Other questions on the income component and expense component? Okay, let's move into efficiency factors and learned outcomes. This is really important, and I think that there are some really good examples here and some things that I want to try and get across to you. So the first one is that we can see in the first two that we have gone from increases in the size of the herd, so that's great. I can see and I can measure what that looks like. Increase in profit sales, perfect. I can see that that's increased as well. Percentage of kits weaned per litter born, so 87 to 90%. That's okay. I mean, that works. The one thing that I would include in here that I think is missing is what the average size of those kits are. So are you averaging 3 to 4, or are you averaging, depending on the breed, are you going to have more like 7 to 8? The larger the number of animals that you have, the easier it is, or the better that justification is, and we can see that change. 3% change is important, don't get me wrong, but is that 1 animal, or is that 2 animals, or is that 3 animals over the time period? How many are you breeding? What does that look like? So what does that 3% change really equate to into the number of animals that you were able to save or keep alive that maybe would have died, okay? So then the next one is then the percentage of live births per kidling. So again, we see that percentage. Again, what does that look like, and articulate that with some sort of numerical value so we can see that. The percentage of rabbits achieving market weight per industry standards at 12 weeks of age. This one I think is done very well. Percentages work in this case because I know exactly what that weight was supposed to be. Again, I think the one thing they could add is the number of animals that they're having and the number of animals that they're working to get to this point, because that really makes this even more impressive. Okay, so the more justification that we can give in that section and in those descriptions, the easier this becomes to score. It has to be measurable. We talked about it earlier. I talked about it earlier where I said about the idea that if it's an efficiency factor and it does not, so I think I got an example in here that has one. Perfect. So this idea of beginner to proficient, we're not able to articulate what beginner is and what proficient is. Every single person has a slightly different definition of that. So developed conservation goals. So a beginner here, how many goals did you develop in 2012? Then how many were developed in 2015? Or what was it the amount of time that it took you to develop that goal and articulate that goal compared to what it was in 2015? Whatever that looks like, a numerical value is going to help make that just a little stronger, in that case, just a little stronger as you work through that process. The same thing as we look at the skills, competency, and knowledge component. Remember that in here, that the first five different competencies, knowledge, and skills that you have to come from your primary area. So remember, and the other piece is that primary area is not dictated based on your project. So for example, if that project is being done on in animal science, it doesn't mean that animal science has to be your primary area. It could be career skill development or career clusters. That's fine. It's up to you on what was the primary area that you think you can talk about with your skills, knowledge, and competencies and the development of those. The other side to that is that you have to have 5 more from outside of your pathway. In both the skills, competency, and knowledge, as well as in the efficiency factors, you need to try and have all 5 and all 10 filled out. Carol, tell me, you can add your piece here as well and tell me what you think, but I'm a big believer that it is better to have 10 that are really well done and they're thought out and they're thought through that actually pertain to the student than having even 3 that are really well done. You can't shortcut them and you can't make them and just kind of like throw them together and make it quick and just put something on the paper so you have 5. That doesn't cut it. I mean, we spend time and read every single one of these and we go through them with a fine-tooth comb to understand exactly what the student is learning, how they're growing, how they're developing, how they're progressing their knowledge level. And we find those that don't necessarily fit. And they're not really well articulated. Make sure you spend time writing those out and giving detail in them. So as you look at this, it needs to pertain directly to this, to the actual, whatever this knowledge area is or that competency area is in the performance indicator from the AFNR standards. The other piece is as you're describing this, I think this is a great example. So prescribe and administer animal feed additives and growth proponents to animal production. This is a great example where 18% protein results in a higher percentage of muscle. Perfect. So did you increase that? That explanation could be expanded a little bit to increase and show how you made that change. What were you doing and what change did you make? How did you learn from that? What did you see as the outcome? Those things need to be included in here. So again, we can see what that student's learned and how they've applied that to their program over time. It's not just about that they were able to do that and they're saying that they did it. They have to be able to demonstrate that and articulate and show that they did that as well. Questions on efficiency factors or the skills, competency, and knowledge, or anything, Carol, that you would want to add on those as well?
Nope, great job.
The next one's the resume, and I'm going to be real honest. As long as you fill it out based on the template that is in AET, you shouldn't really have any problems. Make sure that it does not go over 3 pages, okay? Keep it succinct, keep it, and make sure you include as much as you can to show what that student has done, but make sure that it stays within the page requirement, and it stays, because that's going to be an immediate kind of piece where they stop looking at certain things. As long as it's there, as long as the student's been involved, this is typically a pretty easy area to get all 3 points. Okay, so just make sure that all those components are present and that you're able to see them all, and you should be good to go on that section. That's not a very high stakes section. When we get to the photos, there are a couple of things, there's a couple of things that I would tell you when you're looking at the photos and the way that they're put in there. One, they should be in color, they should be clear and crisp. If they're horizontal, I think in the new process, they fit a lot better. And they look a lot better on the page, and that's going to then help it make a look like you've spent some time and really kind of thought through it a little bit more. They need to be action shots. The student has got to be included in it. They need to be doing something that's related to their program. It should not then say, in this picture, I am doing this. It should say that this is whatever that was, and this is why it's important to my program, this is what I've done, and this is why I do it. And it's an explanation of what's going on, not just telling us what you're doing and a description of the picture, but actually what that picture means and why it's important to the overall program. They're not worth a lot of points, so don't get me wrong. It's not a section that you've got to really delve into, and it's not going to be it typically is not a make or break section, but it is one of those things where you're actually going to go through the process and you're going to see how that student can actually articulate some of those things as well. Carol?
Back to the resume really quick, Eric.
Yeah.
You need to make sure that you only have things like if you're doing an application for this year for 2020, that the resume doesn't include anything in 2020 in it, that it only includes things up to December 31st, 2019. Unless it's an agriculture class that the student was taking that went into 2020, so it could be like a 1920 kind of class, and any of the skills or any of the information in there, if they can have anything, any certifications or anything related to their project, that's always helpful as well.
Yep, I was going to bring that up at the very end because I think that's one of the big things, but thank you for adding that here. That is throughout the entire application as well as on the efficiency factors. There's a lot of times that students will get to a point where they think it's just really simple for them to type in 2020 because that's what they're used to typing at that point, or they're trying to tell themselves that that's what they should be typing. And that's when they type it in here. As soon as we see a 2020 in the application, if it is not related to a course that they're taking or an office that they're in, it immediately disqualifies the student and they're sent to the bottom of the list. They get one score and they're done. It's a very, very, very big thing that's important. I agree, and that's one of the general tips I was going to add as well, Carol, is if you're pulling pieces from a larger SAE program, but you're trying to fit it into one of them just because maybe you've got a diversified crop SAE program, but you really want to put it into just forage for a proficiency application, that's fine, and that's perfectly acceptable. But don't talk about all of those different areas that you may have in there as well, because that's going to cause you some issues because people are going to read that other section. They're not going to know what hours and what money and what values only articulate to your forage project versus all of the other things that you're going to be doing as well. The last piece then is this personal page that I want to talk about. This is completely given to you. It is completely up to you what you want to put in there, but it should be something that adds additional information to the actual SAE. And this is the one that I like to talk about, that 2020 component as well. This is really, really hard for some teachers to pull together because it may be, and Diane, I'm thinking about this with you, this may be really hard because they are only going to have been in your class for that one school year. And so it's not necessarily even one calendar year that they're there. And so you've got to be careful that on that personal page, if you're pulling some sort of document from somewhere that's already been developed, that there isn't a date on that. That date will get them in trouble as well. And so we can check the rest because we're hand entering a lot of that other information. This is one that sometimes people will pull some document because they think that it helps to articulate what they were doing, but it actually has that next year's date. So in this case, a 2020 date on it. And that becomes an issue when it comes to the overall application. Okay. Again, this can be pictures. If you think that pictures are the best way to articulate what you did in your application, Great. It could be that they're showing the animal and that's a really important part to it. Wonderful. It could be that they're out mowing some different lawns, and so you're trying to see what types of landscapes they're dealing with and some of the projects that they've actually completed. That's even better. So definitely keep in mind that this is all up to you what you want to include, but in the end of the day, it should have something that helps add value to that application or helps explain some things from the application. So as we walk away from this, and I'll answer some questions here in just a second, there are a couple of things that I want to make sure, and some major tips that I want to go over. One, Carol, I know I just added it, but one is the use of the current year. So whatever that current year, in this case 2020, next year 2021, it cannot show up in the application. The only way that it can is if it's an office that it's extended from 19 into 20, or it's a class that extended from 19 into 20. That everything should be, as far as your efficiency factors, as well as your skills, competency, and knowledge, there should be some numerical values to help justify what it is that you've done and what it is that you're doing in your program. Your income and expense statement is going to be sometimes a make or break area. So make sure that you spend some time making sure that everything does add up correctly, that there isn't an error in some of the numbers, that the values that should be calculated into one section are all getting there as well, so that they're canceling out as far as revenue and as an expense. So make sure that that page is done well. And I think sending it to multiple different people to look at and to calculate and to evaluate is always helpful in that component. Make sure that you're using current and non-current correctly based on the application, and make sure that you've got the right information in there and that it's articulating that your project is ongoing. So that if you didn't sell all of your animals, that you still have feed on December 31st. If you're running a landscaping business, that your landscape business is still going to be able to operate because you've got some equipment that you're going to be able to use. It doesn't just magically vanish because it's the end of the year. Okay. And then the last tip that I have is, make sure that when you're in each of the writing sections and each of the write-ups that you have someone that has a strength in English language and grammar, that they take some time to read over it and make sure that there are not spelling and grammatical errors. While that is not necessarily a portion of the application, is grammar and spelling, it does come into play when something cannot be understood because there are so many grammatical errors in that section. That becomes a really sad day for that student because we just don't know exactly what they're trying to say. With that, what questions might you have about proficiency applications?
Hey, Eric,
Yes.
can you talk about the finalists, like how that there are 4 finalists picked from, not necessarily from different regions of the country, how that goes on?
Yeah, absolutely. So what happens is at the scoring tables, there are 4 individuals from around the country that are scoring the applications for the first round. They go there, they get scored, they bring them up, and then another table will look at them, they evaluate them. They confirm that there was no issues, or they didn't see something else that might have been an issue in that application. And then that moves on to the superintendent of the proficiency applications, as well as the national staff member, that they then articulate that and write that up for us. From there, and from that table, there are 4 individuals that are going to be considered as a national finalist, and there is 1 alternate, and that is the 5th place person. The student, and so here's the one caveat that a lot of people don't understand, is that just because the student is a national finalist does not mean that that student has to show up to national convention to go through the interview process. I am not saying that you should not be there, but if they don't, I have seen individuals that were the national finalists and that did not show up to the interview and still win the national award because of the balance of some of the application and then the interview and just the score split. There was just such a point difference that a 0 in that section still was, they don't necessarily get a 0 in that because it's still based on the application, but the interview is based on the student's ability to answer questions about that application. So if that student doesn't show up and the judge has questions about it and they can't get those questions answered, they're going to deduct some more points. However, if that application is so well done that it doesn't, they just don't have questions and it still scores really well, they still may end up as a winner because of the fact that that time isn't there, or that they weren't there. I mean, it's just such a well done application. When they're at national convention, what'll happen is there are then 4 individuals that will go into the room. Those 4 individuals then have an opportunity to spend 2 minutes each with all 4 of them in the room, explaining what their project or program was and giving them a 2 minutes introduction to it. Each student gets 2 minutes, and then they all exit the room again. Then 1 student at a time comes in, and the judges get 20 minutes to then ask them questions about their project. They can take all of that time, they can take less of that time. It just depends on what questions they have. As soon as they're done with those questions, the students are free to go. I know several years ago there was an international experience that went along with proficiency applications and that they would be selected for that. That is not the case anymore. There is not an international experience that goes along with proficiencies anymore. So that is not a second part to the interview process. It is just on their actual SAE and proficiency application. The other thing is that the proficiency application has to, that they can bring, their record books. They can bring in with them, and they can set them underneath their chair to use them to help explain something when they're answering questions about their proficiency application. So if you have a student that has got 4 years of records, they should have all 4 record books and all 4 years worth of records in a 3-ring binder that they can bring in, and they know exactly where things are that they can flip to it, and then they can use that to explain and answer that question as well in the room. Those questions can go anything from being able to justify a value in the proficiency application to just asking simple management questions to asking questions to verify their understanding of the content area. It's really fair game, or it's open game and fair game, or anything is fair game for the students to be asked. Carol, does that answer your question?
Yep, thank you.
Perfect. Melanie, I saw your question in here about the QR codes. There can be a QR code in there as well. I've seen that a lot, and the last time I checked, that was not a disqualification or an issue at all. That could take them to the website. If they have a website that's for whatever business they're running or owning, that's perfectly fine that they can see what that looks like. I do not believe that that's an issue. John, that might be a great question to ask Brett Evans at National FFA just to confirm. But the last time I saw it, I did not see that have any points taken off at all.
You want to be really careful in these applications for the kids to refer to a video or something online, because the link that they go to either, possibly couldn't work or could have information in it that goes against or not against or doesn't agree with some of the things that the student had in the application. So really, really think about the videos that you might be using. And one other thing, Eric, that you didn't talk about was the letters of recommendation that people write.
Yes.
You want to make really sure that whatever information is in that letter of recommendation is validated in the application.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Sorry about that. I skipped over that slide was there, and I don't know why I skipped over it. I am so sorry.
Okay, these are all very great questions. Keep them coming if you have them. However, as Dr. Foster likes to say, this is not a hostage situation. So if you have questions, please utilize any of the avenues available to ask it. But if not, we want to be respectful of everybody's time. So ask away.
John, is this going to be available for people? This video, this webinar?
Yes, the recording will be emailed out in a follow-up email, as well as uploaded to the TJAG PSU YouTube channel for viewing after the fact.
Thank you.
Okay, we can do a last call for any questions you may have. We got, okay, Melanie has a question in chat about the instructor's statement.
Melanie, I've not heard that, but I will, let's, give me 1 second here. Let me do this. really quickly, and let me look up and see if I can find some things here on that. I don't, to my knowledge, the instructors page is still there because it's all based on the previous rubrics. So give me 1 second here.
While Dr. Rubenstein is pulling that information, I'd just like to remind everybody of our third session of the Center's 3-Circle Summer Series, which will be tomorrow at 10 a.m. with Ms. Darla Romberger, covering best practices and tips for training an outstanding chapter officer team. If you have not already done so, please register at the link found in the email that Beth sent out, I believe a week or so ago. Same time, 10 a.m. And we would love to see you there.
John, I had tried to like link up to the, I guess the first one
No.
that was offered, and it said that, you know, it wasn't taking, and I know you guys had said that they weren't taking registrations, but that you could still like sign up to hear it or see it or whatever. And when I had gone to the link, it wouldn't let me do it.
Is that to the Dr. Gagnon one on Monday?
Yes.
Okay, I apologize for that. I'll be glad to send you the recording to that session.
Okay. Yeah. It's not a problem. I mean,
Sure.
my brain is like exploding with all of this and all this new information anyway. So that would be wonderful. Thank you.
You bet.
And John, Melanie is correct. The instructor statement is not in there for this year.
All right, very good. There you have it. Any other questions for Dr. Rubenstein? I know as the data showed in our registration, this is a pretty novice group when it comes to national proficiency applications. Dr. Rubenstein did an outstanding and very thorough job of going through that application, and I cannot imagine anybody walking away from this without some newfound knowledge and, again, hopefully some confidence that empowers you to assist students with this application moving forward. So I hope that is correct, and I hope you have gleaned as much knowledge from this as I would expect you to. Unless there's any final thoughts or questions, I'd like to thank Dr. Rubenstein extensively for his time and commitment to this, as well as to all of you for joining us today. And we hope to see you tomorrow, as well as at the future sessions throughout the rest of the summer.